Welcome to another video tutorial on YouTube channel of tutorialspedia.com. In this video, I will explain and demonstrate how we can use Postman in order to create OpenAPI specifications. Earlier in my tutorials, I explained that how we can use Swagger editor, and also I created another tutorial where I explained that how we can use Stoplight Studio to create API definitions. We will see how we can create OpenAPI version 3.0 or 3.1 definitions. Previously, we used to create Swagger 2.0 definition. So the concept and the method for creating all of these specifications, whether we use OpenAPI specification 3.0 or 3.1 or any other version, primarily remains same, although there are certain differences and changes for each of these versions. We often use Postman for testing of our APIs, but the great thing is that this tool is equipped with the necessary features to create the API specifications as well. And that's what we are going to cover in this tutorial. Let's look at the high level details of the topics that are going to be demonstrated in this video tutorial. We will be creating an API specification, OpenAPI 3.0 specification in Postman. For that, we can use either of the two options. We can make it in JSON format or YAML format. And for this tutorial, we will simply create it with JSON format. And for this purpose, we will be creating users API. And this users API will have multiple endpoints and multiple methods. As we know, different HTTP methods or HTTP verbs can be used when defining our API specification. So in this tutorial, we will be covering get, post, delete, and we can also extend it towards other method like put or patch as well. But for the sake of simplicity, we will focus on get, post, and delete. So using get, post, and delete, we will see how we can create different endpoints and then associate those endpoints with these methods. For retrieval of the user, creation of a specific user, deleting a specific user based on the user ID, and then we will also see how we can do this thing in bulk to retrieve multiple users in the form of a users array or a list. And also we will see how we can create multiple users through a single endpoint. So all this is going to be very exciting, and I hope that by end of this video tutorial you will be confident enough to define your API specifications using Postman without relying on any other tools or any other options available in the market. So now let's jump into the demonstration and start creating our API specification using Postman. I have already opened Postman as you can see here, and once you open your Postman, then you see option of collections, APIs, environments, and history. From here we want to create API specification, so we will choose this APIs option, and then there is an option to create an API. You can also use this option new, or if you have already a specification, that can also be used using this import option. But in our case, we are going to create API from the scratch, so we will click on this create an API. And as soon as you click on this button create a new API, then there is an interface where you can specify basic details of your API. So I'm going to rename it to users API. You can name it anything, and then you can have a basic and high level summary of your API under this about this API section. I will just write a basic thing that this is a users API, and in the description I can put further details like this API provides following methods, and then I can just create a list: create user, delete user, delete user, get a user, create users list, and get all users. You can see this is a proper Postman editor where you have options of formatting this, and you can provide meaningful description of your API. I'll just click on save button, and once you have this, now you have basic information of your API populated. And next what I can do is that I can choose some other options if you want, like if you want to have collection, or if you want to connect it to a repository, we can do that as well. If you see here, we have option to connect to GitHub, Bitbucket, or we can use to GitLab software as a service or Azure DevOps as well. But we will not do that because that's not the scope of this tutorial. What we are going to do is that we are going to directly create a definition, and if you click on this plus button, you have option to import files, author from the scratch. So in our case, we are going to choose this option, author from the scratch, so that we create our API specifications from the scratch. Now here you are given the options that what type of API definition you want. There are many options available, like you have API specification with the OpenAPI 3.0, 3.1, 2.0, 1.0, or even you can create WSDL 2.0, WSDL 1.0, and you can also create RAML 0.8 or 1.0, GraphQL, and for our case we are going to choose OpenAPI 3.0. The latest one is 3.1. There isn't much difference in terms of creating the API specification, but I'll prefer to create it with widely used OpenAPI 3.0. And then you have definition format. You have option to create it in YAML format and JSON format. Let's create it in the JSON format. And then there is a very good option, use a boilerplate. If you put it hover around on this info button, it states that a boilerplate template will have the necessary components by default to save your time while writing the specs. So this is a very good feature that if you check this button, now the API specification will be created with some basic schemas and some basic endpoints already added. And instead of creating everything from the scratch, you can just modify those according to your requirements, and that really saves some of your time. So I'll choose this option and I will click on this create API definition. And as soon as you click on this button, you will see that some information has already been populated because of this boilerplate option. Like it has already created a path slash spacecraft slash spacecraft ID. Basically, it's just creating some API for spacecrafts with one path and only a get method. And then it has some schemas for spacecraft IDs, spacecraft object, and the other object, and some security schema which is based on API key. So what we are going to do is that we are going to just update this existing one and make it according to our requirements. And in our requirement is to create the users API. So very first thing that I'm going to do is that I'm just going to update this description which has been automatically added. Perform API operations for users. So this is just a simple description. You can write according to your requirements. And then what I'm going to do is that first of all, I'm going to create required schemas and going to update the schemas. Schemas are the very important part of API specification creation, because you are going to refer to these schemas when defining the input or output structure of your individual API endpoints. So here we have spacecraft ID, which we are going to just change to user ID because we are going to play with the user, and I will just name it as user ID and the unique identifier of a user. Instead of spacecraft, I'm going to create it like a user, and then its type is going to be string, although you can change it to integer as well, but let's keep it a string. And then yeah, you have a spacecraft object here. Instead of spacecraft, I'm going to create a user object, and it is a type object, and then it has required fields ID, name, and type. Let's keep it as is because it stands true for the user object as well. And then in the ID, if you see here, it's referencing. We already created, if I save it, we already created a user ID. So that's what we are going to refer here. So if you see here under the schemas, we have user ID. So instead of creating it separately, the type and everything, I'm just going to refer it. So for that purpose, if you just put here user ID, and now if you just try to see it where it is pointing to, you can see it's pointing to this user ID which we already created. So now we have user ID, and then we are updating this user object where we have ID, name, and type. So ID is referencing to user ID, and then we have name which is going to be of type string, and then we have the type. So in the type, if you see, we have enumeration. So we want to restrict the value for this type to some specific fields. So let's update it. I want to have only 3 types of user, which can be admin, which can be editor, or it can be a guest. So there are 3 types of possible values for this type object, a type value under the user object. So this is the second change that I have done. And next, if you see here, we have an error object, and under this we have only one field, which is message. So this message is a human readable message that we will use for any of the error scenarios, because once we will be creating the endpoints and we will be defining the methods, there will be cases of non-happy scenarios as well. It's not always 200 or 201. There can be cases of 400 error, 500 error, or some other type of errors. So that in all those scenarios we will be returning error object. We are not going to make any changes for the security scheme here, and we will keep it as API key, although you can have option of OAuth and other type of schemes as well. So next important thing I want to do is that I want to create another object with the name users, because if you see here we have a user object, and we can also we will have a requirement to have multiple users. So for that purpose I want to create a users object which is going to be of type uh, array. So I will just define it like this. So I will make the type as array, and then under this we will have another field with the name items, because array should have some items. And under the items we are going to specify what are the items available for this, and here we are going to just reference to that individual user. So I will explain it once I have created it. Okay, so we need to create a reference to the user object. So I will just write $ref, and then I will specify the components to which I'm referring to. And if you just try here, you can see that we can just write user, because we have a user schema. All right, so now we have user object, we have users object, and also we have done all the other required changes that were needed for the schema level. Now we have the schemas ready. What next we are going to do is that we are going to just modify and we are going to update the required fields for our endpoints. The first thing I want to do is that I just want to update this to, instead of spacecrafts, I want to make it user, and this one is gonna be user ID. And here in the name I'm going to change it to user ID, and then description is going to be updated. Instead of the existing one with the spacecraft, I will just write user. So it is a unique identifier of the user. And then what you will do is that you will specify what kind of input it's going to be. It's going to be a path variable. We can have option of query parameter, and we can also have headers, but in our case we are going to use it as path parameter. And we are going to set it as required true, which means it's a mandatory path parameter. And then the reference is going to be updated to user ID. So now this slash users and then slash user ID is going to be one endpoint that we have defined, and this is referencing to this user ID that we have already defined under the schemas. Under this endpoint we will specify what kind of methods we want to implement. So we want to implement two methods under this, get and delete. Although we can also create one endpoint for put as well, but we want to just create one for get, one for delete, so that we can create a new user and we can delete a user. So for the get, we will just update few things here, because we already created it using boilerplate. So of course we need to update everywhere wherever spacecraft is mentioned. So read a user instead of spacecraft. And then get has the in happy scenario, in case of get we get 200 as the response code. And here we are going to make required changes for the description and the user corresponding to provided user ID. So this is the update to the description, and after that we are going to just specify if we want to make any other changes. And in the content we are going to refer to the user object, because it's going to return as a single user. So we will refer to user, not the users one. So basically whenever whenever a client is going to make a request to slash user ID, I mean user, it will be based on a specific user ID. In that case, if it's a success, then 200 error code will be returned, and the body of the response will be creating a user object. And user object, as you know, we already defined, it contains details about the user, including the user ID and type. And we also defined one more element, we can just see user ID, name and type. So this is going to be the output for this 200 case. And if you go down, based on the boilerplate option, we already got some additional response codes configured here. 404, if there is no particular response for this, 404 means not found. So in that case, we will just for the provided user ID, we will just update it that no user found for the provided user ID, and it will be returning the error schema. We already defined error schema which contains a message. Similar way, we can define other unhappy scenario error codes. In this case, 500 error code is also defined, which is unexpected error, and it's also returning same type of error structure based on the schema that we defined. This is one part where we have just created a get method. Now we can just create another method for the delete as well. And for that purpose, what I will do is that I will just copy this whole. So I will copy this path and then I will just write it after putting a comma. And now we are going to update it to delete. So instead of, because we already have a get, we want to have another method under the same endpoint with the delete verb, and we will just update this delete the user course. And then after that, delete, in case of delete, the input we want is that only one particular response should be returning only the user ID which has been deleted, not the whole user. So the only thing we will have to do here is that instead of sending the whole user, we want to just return a user ID as a response. So whenever a client sends a request to delete a user with a user ID, if it's successfully deleted, we will just send back our user ID in the response. Of course, it's not the ideal case. In the real scenario, we should have some specific maybe correlation ID or maybe some different method. But for the sake of simplicity, we are just going to return back the user ID for the user which has been deleted. And then we have 404 and 500 in the similar way, which we are not going to change. So now if you just save it and see what is the current status, in the current status we have only one path slash user ID. That's one endpoint, and under this endpoint we have already defined two methods, get and delete. Now what we are going to do is that we are going to cater for the other scenario of bulk update or bulk retrieval. That is, we are going to create another endpoint slash users, and under that we will have get and post methods. So that's what we are going to define now. For that purpose, what I will be doing is that I will be just creating another path. So if you see this path, okay, let me just copy something. So this path is ending at this point. So I'm just going to put a comma, and then I'm going to define another path slash users. So now we have another endpoint created, but this is not complete yet. If you see here under the paths, because it's still in error as we haven't completed this part, so it will be reflecting correctly in this place only once everything has been defined for this. So for this one slash user, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to first define the required, there is no parameter required, so we will not have any parameter section, and the only thing is I will just copy this get, and then I will update it to post, as well as we will need get and post. So I'll just copy get first. Okay, I'm just copying the whole part. Okay, so I copied this get option. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to make the required updates here now. So read a user, instead of this I will just update this description or summary to get all users. And in this case, in 200 response, the only change I'm going to do is that instead of user, I'm going to reference to users object, because it's going to return the whole list of users. So update the description here, return list of all users. So this is the update I'm going to make over here, and then I'm not going to make any other changes for this. And if you see here now, under the users, we have get option available already. So we have a get method, and in the response, it has 200, 4, and 500 response. For 200, we already defined it to return the users object. Users is containing a list of all the users, as I explained earlier. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is to define the post method as well for this. So under this users, we already defined get. So I'll just copy this part and I will define the post. But there will be a difference in case of post, because post is expecting a body in the proper structure body. That's what we will do here. Let me just copy this part. Okay, so I'm copying this and I'm going to do the required modifications to create a post method for bulk retrieval, for the bulk creation, sorry. So I'll just rename it to post, and I will update this summary to create multiple users, and then I will just change something here. In case of uh, post, the response code should be 201, not 200, and that should not be returning. Okay, so now there is a case that what exactly we want to return. If we want to return just a message, or we want to return something else. So ideally we should have another structure of the response in case of this, or we can have only 201 even without anything in the content. That's also a possibility. And just 201 can be considered as a successful response. Or maybe there can be case that where we want to return a list of user IDs for all the users. But here let's keep it again too simple as much as possible, and just return the whole list of users that have been created. So basically whatever we will be passing in the request, same will be returned as a response. So here we want to create the request body, and in the request body what I'm going to do is that I'm going to define what kind of request it's expecting. And here I will write $ref, and then I will just refer to the component. Okay, so now this whole users we are going to expect as a request body, and based on that we will have a 201 response, and 201 response will contain the whole list of users that have been created. Okay, now if I see here under the users we have get and post, and previously we created user with the user ID path parameter, and that has get and delete. So in this way now we have a complete API specification which is having two endpoints, users slash user ID, and we have slash users which is for the batch operations. So under user slash user ID we have two methods, get and delete. And using get we can get a specific user based on user ID, and we have delete which will delete a specific user based on provided user ID. And we have slash users under which we have get, which is going to return a list of all the users. And we have post, which expects a list of users as a request body, and then creates the user and then returns the list of all the users which have been created. So this is pretty much simple way of creating API specification using Postman. Of course, you might think that we haven't considered all the standards and the way we have created this API specification. There are a lot of improvements possible, but the scope of this tutorial was just to explain you the basics, how you can create API specifications using this boilerplate option in a very easier manner using Postman. And subsequently it's up to you how you want to standardize it, how you want to update it and make it more meaningful according to your requirements. And this is just to create the API specification. It's not going to work for you. It's just a blueprint of your API. Of course you will need some tool or some way of implementing these APIs on the server side. For example, I already created many tutorials how you can create how you can implement your REST API using tools like TIBCO, MuleSoft, or you can use even Java or any other programming language. But that's not something which is scope of this tutorial. This tutorial just covers how you can create the specs, then subsequently you can use it according to your requirements. That's it from this tutorial. I hope that the information conveyed will be helpful for you. If you have any questions, you can write in the comment section. And for more, you can visit my website tutorialspedia.com. And if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to this Tutorialspedia YouTube channel. Thank you very much.